You're not weak, you're not dysfunctional, and you're not broken. But if there's one thing that's true, it's that you've been buried for too long. By silence, by expectations, by a world that keeps trying to make you into someone else. Maybe you were that child who asked questions that were too deep, and adults avoided them. You were sensitive and labeled as too much. You were honest and told you should be more well-behaved. And so, you grew up. Not as someone who was heard, but as someone who had to learn to stay quiet just to not be left out. You didn't lose yourself. You buried yourself to survive. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? You've stepped into crowded rooms only to shrink inside. Not because you lacked confidence, but because you got used to being judged every time you showed your real self. You've wanted to say something important, but held back. Not because you lacked the words, but because a whisper inside said, "What if they think less of you if you say it?" You've had beautiful, personal, passion, deep, meaningful things, but you hid them because you learned being too different means being left out. And none of that happened because you were weak, not because you needed healing, but because you were taught to live as a version of yourself that would be more acceptable. You learned how to wear a mask. You learned how to say just the right things. You learned how to be fine even when you were drowning inside. And sadly, you became good at it. So good that even you forgot who you really were. That's not brokenness. That's burial, like a seed that was never watered, like a gem thrown into the bottom of a well, like a song that was never played because no one had the patience to hear its melody. You don't need to be fixed. You just need to be unearthed from where you were hidden. Maybe you're listening to this right now and your heart stirs because you know exactly how that feels. The feeling of not being seen, the feeling of having once shown your true self and being judged for it, the feeling of having to shrink just to avoid being hurt again. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." He was right. There is nothing more frightening than being real in a world that demands you pretend, and nothing more lonely than being misunderstood even when you've done nothing wrong. But what you need to hear today is not a comforting phrase, not another healing trend, not some hollow call to stay positive. What you need to hear is the truth. You were never weak. You just never got the chance to live in the right way. You don't need to become better. You just need to start peeling off the dust that's buried your real self. You're not a glitch. You are a forgotten design. You're not someone who needs to learn self-love from internet checklists. You are someone who once loved themselves deeply, but after being hurt too many times, grew distant from that self. You used to shine. It's just your light got covered by criticism, by rejection, by all the times you were ignored. You don't need another piece of advice. You need to be called by your real name. That's why you're here. In this video, at this exact moment, not by accident, but because there's a part of you inside that has never died. It's just been lying still, waiting to be awakened. Maybe that part is the dream you gave up on, the voice you silenced yourself, a version of you that is true, beautiful, but buried under the judgment of others. And if you're brave enough to keep listening, we'll start digging layer by layer, not to fix you, but so you can look at yourself and realize you were never wrong. Do you remember the first moment in life when you started to doubt who you really were? Maybe it was a parent-teacher meeting where someone said, "Your child is too quiet, not social enough, needs to be trained more." Maybe it was the day you came home with red eyes after being bullied, and the adults just told you, you need to toughen up. Or maybe it was the time you shared a very honest thought, and all you got was a cold look, or a dismissive response. Stop it. Don't be so dramatic. From that moment on, you began to wonder, Maybe something is wrong with me. You started watching others not to understand them, but to mimic them, to fit in. You learned how to stay quiet at the right time, say the right things, smile at the right moments. You learned not to be too sensitive, not to overthink, not to be weak. And bit by bit, you disappeared from yourself. No one ever clearly told you, give up your nature. But everything around you quietly suggested it, that if you want to be accepted, you must fit in. If you want to be loved, you must be easy to understand. We don't lose ourselves all at once. We erode day by day, by words that seem harmless, by moments we're ignored, and by labels placed on us before we even had a chance to speak. You weren't wrong, but you were made to believe that you were. You weren't weak, but you lived in an environment that constantly made you feel small. Take a moment. How many things did you once love that you now hide? How many things you once believed in that you now avoid? How many things you once wanted to say that you now swallow just to avoid being misunderstood? We grow up carrying wounds that were never named. Times we were overlooked. Times we were laughed at. Times we tried to be honest, but that honesty made people walk away. Over time, you developed a survival skill, pretending to be okay. You became normal. You became acceptable. You became easy to be around. But deep inside, you felt like a stranger to yourself. Have you ever asked yourself, why do I always feel like I'm not enough? Why do I keep pushing myself, even when no one's forcing me? Why do I try so hard to please people, even the ones who don't deserve it? The answer isn't that you need to change. The answer is, you've been living in a role someone else gave you, for so long that you started thinking it was you. Carl Jung called this the persona, a mask we're forced to wear to survive in society, but the cost of that is burying our true self. You don't feel whole because you've never lived fully as the person you really are. You don't feel confident because you've never been given permission to exist as yourself. You can be smart, kind, hardworking, and still feel empty if your true self has been locked away for too long. And here's the truth you need to face today, though it might be hard to hear. You're living as someone who's been assigned a role, not someone who's chosen to live. You didn't choose how you were born. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your environment. But you can choose again. Will you keep playing this role, or will you start removing it? And to make that choice, you must pause. Pause the loop of constantly seeking approval. Pause the habit of chasing other people's validation. Pause the instinct to hide from yourself whenever you're alone. Be honest. When was the last time you felt truly proud of yourself? Not because you achieved something, not because someone praised you, but because, deep inside, you knew you were being real. If you don't remember, if you've never felt that way, then maybe you've never truly lived as your full self, and that's not your fault. But from this moment on, it is your responsibility. No one can free you unless you're willing to unearth what was buried. No one can let you be yourself. If you keep asking for permission to be real, you don't have to wait any longer. You don't need another sign from the universe. You don't need another breakdown to wake up. You just need to look at your own patterns and realize, this isn't me. This is the role I've been playing, and the real me is waiting to be awakened. If you're brave enough to face that truth, the rest of your life could start to change. You've smiled just so no one would ask, are you okay? You've said, I'm fine, even when all you felt inside was a cold, empty void. You've walked over your own needs just to hold on to a relationship that no longer had anything left to hold. Not because you were weak, but because you believed. If you kept pushing through, kept giving in, kept blending in, then maybe everything would be okay. But it wasn't. The only thing that wore down was you. Have you ever been at a crowded party, trying to blend in, trying to talk, trying to smile, but you still felt like a stranger in the room. Have you ever laid in your familiar bedroom, surrounded by comfort, and still felt completely disconnected inside? Not because you didn't know how to enjoy life, not because you were too difficult, but because the real you wasn't present. Have you ever deeply loved something, painting, writing, singing, reading, philosophy, wandering, alone, but gave it up because someone said, that won't get you anywhere in life? Have you ever tried to explain a deep sadness, only to hear, stop being so negative? Have you ever loved someone so much that you lost all your boundaries, because you were afraid that if you stopped giving, they would stop staying? Those were the moments you chose. Silence, not to keep peace, but to survive, not to mature, but to avoid being left behind. But each time you did that, you stepped a little further away from yourself. No one noticed. You still worked, still talked, still looked fine, but only you could feel it. Each passing day, you lived like a shadow, not invisible pain, not broken down in tears, but no longer connected to anything that made you feel alive. You could lie still for hours, not sad, not happy, just empty. You avoided mirrors not because you hated yourself, but because you no longer recognized who you'd become. You sat next to someone and felt like you were talking to a wall. No one hit you, but you felt hurt. No one blamed you, but you felt like you had to apologize. No one walked away, but you still felt alone right in the middle of everything. That's not a sickness. That's a sign. A sign that you've been living disconnected from your true self. You don't need a diagnosis. You need to reconnect. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But no one tells you that becoming yourself means facing rejection, judgment, even loss. You will have to give up being pleasant in other people's eyes, artificial peace, relationships that only survive when you play a comfortable role. That is the price of climbing out of the psychological grave you buried yourself in. You may have lived your life like someone trained not to bother anyone, not to make people uncomfortable, not to make a scene. But at what point do you stop and ask, if I'm living like this, then who's really living for me? You weren't born to be a safe copy. You were born to be your full self, even if that means walking alone for a while. You weren't born to just fit in. You were born to become. You weren't born to endure. You were born to awaken. And the part of you that's hurting now is the buried part calling you back. That's why you feel uneasy in places that should bring peace. That's why you feel empty in achievements others admire. That's why you feel off, even when life looks on track, because you're living without being present. A quiet absence, but one that echoes. A missing self that no light from the outside can replace. You weren't wrong to have once held back. You're not to blame for trying to blend in, but you will keep hurting if you don't choose to return, to call your true self by name. You don't need to change your whole life overnight. You just need to stop today. Place your hand on your heart and whisper, "I'm still here, and I will not bury myself again." Her name was Ellen. Since childhood, Ellen had been different from other kids. She wasn't loud. She didn't fight to speak up. She didn't run around in the crowd. She often sat alone, drawing things no one really understood, like a gust of wind trapped in a glass jar, a tree growing upside down, or a door standing alone in the middle of a desert. The adults said she was too dreamy. The teachers said she lacked initiative. Her peers thought she was weird and distant. The older she grew, the more she learned to shrink herself. She still drew but hid her sketches in a drawer. She still wrote, but never shared them with anyone. She still had deep thoughts but would only nod quietly when others spoke. just to avoid being labeled too opinionated. Ellen didn't want to be seen as difficult, so she became agreeable. She didn't cry in front of others. She didn't react when criticized. She didn't complain. She didn't demand. She didn't inconvenience anyone. She lived as if she were present, but, in truth, she was hiding behind countless masks, and everything seemed fine, until one day, during a team meeting at work, someone patted her on the shoulder and said, "Ellen, you should try to speak up more. You always do a good job, but no one notices." And in that moment, something inside her cracked, not because it was a harsh comment, but because she suddenly realized she had stayed silent for so long, that even the good she did went unnoticed. No one saw her exhaustion. No one saw her pain. No one even saw that she existed. She was the stable one, always on time, never stirred trouble, never raised her voice. And because of that, she slowly faded from view. That night, Ellen went home and opened the old drawer, where she used to hide her childhood drawings. Each one was a world of its own, a bottled emotion that had never been named, a part of her that had never been acknowledged. She looked into the eyes of the characters she had once drawn, and she cried, not out of regret, but out of tenderness. Tenderness for the little girl who once lived so honestly, but was forced into silence, so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Tenderness for the woman she had become, who had lived far too long in the role of being reasonable. The next day, she posted a short sentence online. "I'm not strong. I just wasn't allowed to be weak." It didn't go viral, just a handful of likes. But one comment came from an old friend. "I always wished I could live like you, deep and true, but I'm too scared of being hurt." Ellen realized something that day. There were many people just like her, but each chose a different way to survive. Some pretend to be okay. Some flaunt fake success. Some run from any deep connection. But all of them suffer from the same wound, not being allowed to be who they truly are. From that day forward, Ellen began writing again, not for others to read, but so she could hear her own voice again after so many years of silence. She drew again, not to display, but to remember the hands that once created her own world without needing anyone's approval. And then something strange happened. It wasn't that people started loving her more. In fact, some said she was weird, depressed, imbalanced. Some even left because she was no longer easy to be around. But this time she didn't try to fix it. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She stayed silent, but it was a silence that came from awareness. Because for the first time in her life, she knew she wasn't broken. She had only been buried. And every day she stepped out of the house was a day she unearthed a little more of who she once was. She started smiling again, not to be seen, but because she could finally feel the light inside her returning. She started saying no, not to rebel, but because she realized boundaries aren't selfish, they're survival. She began journaling, not for nostalgia, but as a way to reconnect with her true self. Beneath all the dust of the years, no one noticed that a quiet transformation was taking place, but she knew, she could feel it. In every vein, in every thought, in every breath, everything was slowly coming back into alignment. She didn't change the world. She simply stopped burying herself, and in that journey, she discovered something more powerful than any philosophy she had ever read. Sometimes, you don't need to keep pushing forward. You just need to dig up the parts of yourself you once forgot. We often judge ourselves by a deeply unfair standard. If we don't fit in with our surroundings, then something must be wrong with us. But no, you weren't born to fit into everything, and the fact that you don't blend in might not be your fault at all. Maybe you're just living under the wrong conditions. An introverted, thoughtful, deeply sensitive person, if forced to be loud, extroverted, and constantly perform, will soon believe, I'm the problem. A highly intuitive, emotionally attuned soul, if raised among cold, dismissive people who mock feelings, will soon label themselves, I'm abnormal. A person who lives with honesty, if raised in a fake, controlling, scripted environment, will soon either tense up or shrink down just to survive. Do you see the paradox here? No, you're not broken. You're just in the wrong place, with the wrong people, living in the wrong way. Like a wild orchid, if taken out of the forest and planted in a decorative pot, watered with tap water, placed under a roof with no sun, it can't bloom, not because it's weak, but because it's trapped in conditions that were never meant for it. You are the same. You don't need to try and be like others. You need to know who you are, and where the soil fits the roots of your true self. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey of becoming whole, without being swallowed by the shadows of others or the roles society pushes on you. But sadly, most of us go the other way. We grow up learning to rationalize our burial. We make pretending to be okay a way of life. We call endurance maturity, and we call distorting ourselves being considerate. Then, at some point, you realize you've come a long way, but don't know where you're going. You've tried so hard, but don't know for whom. You've played so many roles, but no longer remember your true face. That confusion, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign you're starting to wake up. And when you do, the first step isn't to change the world or rise above. The first step is to dust off the layers that buried your essence. Remove the layer of, I must be strong all the time. Remove the layer of, I can't upset anyone. Remove the layer of, I should be grateful and just accept. Remove the layer of, I'm flawed if I don't fit in. You remove not to rebel, but to reclaim what was stolen. You remove not to fight the world, but to finally sit with yourself. You don't need to reinvent yourself. You just need to call back the part you once buried. You don't need another life skills workshop. You need to learn how to be real. Even if that honesty makes others uncomfortable, you don't need to rush anywhere. You need to turn inward and realize you're still there. You were never truly lost. Someone who has been buried might take years to fully uncover themselves. But once they do, they become stronger than anyone who lived easily, because they walked through darkness and never lost their light. Because they don't just exist, they know how to live without pretending. And you can begin today. No grand declarations, no need to convince anyone, just one quiet act. Sit down and ask, am I still living a role? Or have I returned to my true self? If that question brings a lump to your throat, that's not weakness. That's the sign of a soul that hasn't been called by its true name in a long, long time. And there's nothing more sacred than that moment, when you sit in silence and know with certainty, I will not bury myself ever again. Let me say it again, not to repeat for the sake of repeating, but so this time you truly hear it with your heart. You are not broken. You were just buried. You don't need another piece of advice. You need a deep calling from within, a voice that carries no one else's tone. It carries your own soul from a place you've long forgotten. You don't need to keep searching for validation out there. You need to accept this. You must be the first to recognize yourself. All these years, you've been playing a role, smiling when you didn't want to, nodding when your heart was screaming no, staying silent when you should have spoken up, pushing forward when you were already running on empty. You've acted so well. No one noticed anything wrong. You seemed fine. No one knew you had already crumbled inside. You've survived. But can you really say you've lived? You once believed it was your fault, that you needed to be fixed, that you weren't good enough, that you had to change to be worthy. No, that's a lie. A lie placed upon you by wounds no one ever named, by the times you were ignored, by the looks that silently told you you should be different. And so, you believed it. You began healing something that wasn't even broken. You tried patching up a soul that was never shattered, just covered in dust. It's time to give yourself back to yourself. Return to the depth that was labeled too much. Return to the emotions once dismissed as weak. Return to the truth, once shamed as troublesome. Return to the dreams, once laughed off as naive. None of that was ever wrong. They just never had the right space, the right people, or the right time. Have you ever felt this? That whenever you're real, you're looked down on. Whenever you're honest, you're pushed away. Whenever you don't meet expectations, you're judged. If yes, then once again, you are not broken. You're just living in a world too lazy to understand. A world that prefers convenience over truth, that prefers roles that are easy to digest, over authentic souls that are hard to label. But this world doesn't nourish you. Other people's comfort won't help you live deeply. External ease won't heal your inner wounds. You don't need to keep being a socially acceptable copy. You need to become a soul that doesn't ask for permission. No, you are not too sensitive. You just still feel pain in a world that's grown numb. No, you are not too complicated. You just refuse to simplify your soul into bullet points made by society. No, you are not a failure. You've just been living too long without grounding into your true self. Let me say it one more time, and let it land. This time, you don't need fixing. You need reviving, living as yourself. No apologies, no justifications, no pretending. This is not rebellion. This is return. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." You've looked outside long enough. You've chased dreams that weren't yours. You've tried to meet expectations that never belonged to you. Now, it's time to look inward and awaken the part of you that's been waiting for years. You are not broken. You don't need more polishing. You only need to start peeling off the masks, one layer at a time. You don't need to become someone else. You only need to find the courage to fully be yourself. Right now, you may feel tight in your chest. You may feel breathless. That's okay. That's the sign that your soul is finally breathing again. After years of being held down, don't rush to stand up. Don't try to do anything just yet. Just stay with that feeling long enough so it can guide you home. This is not a motivation video. This is a calling. Calling the buried part of you to live again. No need to scream. Just rise on your own feet. No more bowing. No more asking for permission. No more silence. You don't need others to understand you. You only need to stop waiting for it from those who never truly tried. You've been silent long enough, not because you had nothing to say, but because you once believed your voice wasn't worth hearing. Not because you were weak, but because you had to live in a place where your strength was distorted. Not because you failed, but because you judged yourself through eyes that were never yours. You don't have to scream, "I'm in pain." You just need to be honest enough to stop hiding. You don't have to prove anything. You just need to be steady enough to break the habit of burying yourself every time you're misunderstood. You've carried too many burdens that weren't yours. Lived by too many definitions that never reflected your nature. Stayed in too many relationships that only existed when you shrank. From now on, you have the right to choose differently. You don't need a breakthrough. You don't need a transformation. You just need the courage to peel off the layers that have covered your true self. The next time you want to speak up, but hesitate. Remember, you have the right to voice your truth. The next time you find yourself exhausted in a shallow conversation, remember, you don't have to force yourself to fit in. The next time you feel lost in a crowd, remember, loneliness isn't always wrong. Sometimes, it's a sign that you're realigning with your true path. You don't need to start from scratch. You just need to start from where you left yourself behind. Maybe that was at 17, when you stopped drawing. Maybe it was at 25, when you gave up on a dream for a safer job. Maybe it was just recently, when you stayed silent during a conversation where you should have spoken up. Go back there, not to blame yourself, but to reconnect with the part of you that never died. It was just buried. You don't need to rush. You just need to be honest. Being honest with yourself, that's the bravest thing you can do. And from that honesty, every door starts to open. No one teaches you how to dig up your soul, but if you're quiet enough, you'll hear the call. Not from outside, but from the deepest place within, where the truest part of you has never stopped existing. This time, you don't need to become worthy. Just choose to rise, not to prove, but to return to yourself. And if there's still something inside you that feels stuck, don't swallow it down again. Just be still, just for a moment. Still, to hear yourself again. Still, to see yourself clearly. Still, to never bury yourself one more time. Because you are not broken. You have never been broken. You were only buried by a world that never understood what you truly needed. And now, you know, if you ever gave up your essence to be loved, if you ever shrank yourself just to avoid being abandoned, if you ever sacrificed who you are just to stay with someone, continue your awakening with the next video in this series. Becoming whole is more important than being loved. You are now ready to reconnect with yourself. No permission needed, no compromises required, and if fate allows, we'll meet again, in a version of you that no longer hides.